3 years, hearings across the country, and now the report detailing the tragic findings of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Haley Lewis, who heads up our hub that covers Indigenous issues, was at the closing ceremony of this inquiry this week. She joins us now from Ottawa via Skype for some perspective. Welcome to the show, Haley.
Hey, Jan.
Now, 36 long months. Tell us what went into this report, 1,200 pages.
You know, the biggest thing, and I think this is where the credit is most due, is to all the families of those women who were missing and murdered, and the survivors who really came forward and shared their testimony with the commission, because without that testimony, we wouldn't have the findings that we have today. They were 15 different sessions all across the country. They took input on various, Métis perspectives, Quebec perspectives, just really looking at all those different varied perspectives. But it was such an emotional labor that really went into this inquiry. And yeah, we really have to thank the families and the survivors for coming forward.
Now, there were 231 calls to justice. You had a chance to look at the report. What stood out to you from those?
Yeah, I mean, 231, it's a lot. There's some that address the government, some that address, workplaces. But the biggest thing to me that really stood out was how it addressed what Canadians could do. This isn't really something that we often see as to how, the average Canadian can really impact an inquiry and help move forward in terms of the work being done to support the MMIWG. So there are some talking about, just reading the final report, standing up for and denouncing these experiences of violence that these women have to endure. But yeah, it was really just the fact that it kind of helped you put into perspective the direct action you can take. And this isn't really something that I've ever seen in the past. So it's really putting onus on you as a reader and hopeful reader of the final report to just really see what you can do.
Now, Haley, are any of these calls to justice legally binding?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to make the difference. So these are actually calls to justice, whereas the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with calls to action. So the report itself actually states that, quote, "It must be understood that these recommendations, which reframe as calls to justice, are legal imperatives. They are not optional. However, despite the labeling of the terms as calls to justice, they aren't automatically laws. Like, what needs to be done in order to make them laws would be for the government to form a committee, review the document, and decide how they want to implement these calls to justice. So they aren't, we're not all breaking the law if we're not abiding by these calls to justice. However, a lot of them do kind of address these basic human rights level issues, or just, so why not act on them and implement these calls to justice into your life? But no, they are not legally binding as they currently stand.
You had mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation report, again, came out in 2015. Any comparison, any overlap from these two reports?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to compare the two because they are addressing very different things. But I think what we can look at is that these calls to justice and calls to action both address kind of at the baseline, in some circumstances, very, very simple things to change on how we can accommodate and make society better for Indigenous people. But, I think the biggest thing that I see is, as I mentioned before, naming them calls to justice instead of calls to action. So with the report having come out in 2015 for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they came out with 94 calls to action. And to date, they've only actually successfully accomplished 10. So the fact that, 4 years and they've done 10 of the 94 is a bit of an abysmal result. So maybe, and I think that's what the hope that the inquiry had, is that calling these calls to justice will kind of put a little bit of a fire under everyone, in hopes that, 5 years down the road, we don't have the same scenario in which only 10 have been acted upon.
Okay, now we have a snippet from Monday when the report was delivered. Sheldon, let's have a look at that.
This is genocide.
With this inquiry, we will be able to say to the academic, to the lawyers, to the people that don't think that there is a genocide today, we have 1,200 pages to prove it.
That was Chief Commissioner Marion Buller and Inquiry Commissioner Michelle Odette. They make up half of the four-person commission that led this inquiry. Now, genocide, that's the term they both used in that clip and has been the focus of much debate this week. Among the critics of it being used in this context was Toronto-based author Erna Paris. Her book, Long Shadows, Truth, Lies, and History, is said to have inspired the House of Commons motion to apologize to residential school survivors, which it did in June 2008. In Tuesday's Globe and Mail, she wrote, in part, "I believe the Commissioner's otherwise excellent report was marred by the gratuitous charge that Canada has committed and continues to commit genocide against its Indigenous populations. Not cultural genocide, a concept that is broadly accepted today with reference to the attempted obliteration of Aboriginal culture in the Indian residential schools, but all-out genocide without qualification." Now, she goes on to say that the National Inquiry has conflated the recent murders of women and girls with the entirety of the Indigenous experience in Canada. She goes on to point out that we forget at our peril that genocide is a legal term. And she also mentions that the word genocide has kind of been kind of turned into a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag. That's one side of the argument. Why did the commissioners, do you believe, use the word genocide, and why was it warranted?
You know, the debate over this term has been something that's been really eating at me, and seeing it on social media. You know, it's really, and I believe that Ms. Paris's opinion is perhaps a bit misguided, and I think that's a common thread among Indigenous people out there is, so I don't think the report was marred by the charge of genocide. I think the media portrayal of the report and the focus on the word genocide is the bigger issue. Like, people are focusing so much on the labeling of genocide instead of focusing on the actual results that have came from the report, that it's kind of seeming that like everyone is really missing the message. And I often wonder, you know, did she read the 1,200-page report before she wrote her article? Mm-hmm. There are over, there's almost 30 pages detailing as to why they chose it. And the Globe also published another anonymous op-ed yesterday morning along the same vein. And, what outlets might not realize is by publishing these kind of op-eds is they're hurting the families and survivors who came forward and were willing to share these stories. So they explain in detail as to why they use it. They also address certain people who have come up with definitions on genocide in the past. Two of the big ones, one of them being Polish Jewish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin, who says that genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accompanied by mass killings of all members of a nation. So it's intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So we're not saying that, this is addressing all Indigenous women, but all Indigenous women are, more susceptible, especially in Canada and the US, to these sorts of violences. And, they touch on the UN definition as well. So if you can look at the report and look at the definitions and still not understand why they chose to use the word, like there's a bigger issue out there. It's, how is this not applicable to the experience of Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women, girls in Canada? Through historical impositions such as the Indian Act and the reserve system, which has led us to the current state of things in Canada. It's hard for me to see how people don't see that this term is applicable, especially due to the definitions that the report specifically cites.
I want to jump in with some more reaction from government officials. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he tweeted, "Facing the hardest of truths is a difficult and necessary step to addressing them. And the hard truth is that we have failed the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, their families, survivors, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people, but we will not fail you any longer." He added on Twitter that he gives his word that the final report will be turned into action. You had mentioned earlier with the Truth and Reconciliation report, only 10 of the 94 calls to action were implemented. Now that the report is finally out, what does it really mean for Indigenous women and girls, but also non-Indigenous Canadians? And what will this mean for, how do we turn this into action for all levels of government?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing right now that we can focus on is the immense amount of work, and we still really have to uplift the survivors and the families who partook in these sessions to make this report happen. And we have to thank them for their experiences. But until the government does its formal review of the report, there isn't necessarily a direct path forward. Um, People can, act upon the calls of justice to themselves, but it is really the responsibility of the government at all levels to put these, calls to justice into motion and actually enact change. A lot of the stuff deals with education and merely educating frontline workers, educating Canadians as to the actual factual history and the past wrongs that these, Indigenous women, girls have experienced. So it's hard that all of this work and onus was initially on Indigenous people to bring to light, and now it's really in the lap of the government to make those changes and to do a formal review of the report and to enact it, hopefully into law, so that stuff like this doesn't continue to happen. So really, at this point, I think as Canadians, what the general population can do is support people who took part in this inquiry and continue to push for the government to do something about it. But it's really the responsibility of everyone if we want to see any change.
Haley Lewis, that's all the time we have. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Again, a very important story that we will continue to follow. That's Haley Lewis, our Hub editor that covers Indigenous issues, joining us from Ottawa. Thanks again.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.